go to the cloud and share my screen here. There we go. So welcome, first of all. Anybody new, looks like mostly familiar faces here. Every Friday, Dan and I go live and we talk about the profit flywheel and different components of the profit flywheel, which I'll break down shortly. And if you've been here, then you are familiar with the big assumption that we're making. And we're going to talk about that today, is that you're in business for a reason other than just to be in business. And every step that you take, the way that we consult and the way that we build things is that it has to be getting you closer to the things that actually matter. I'm not going to dwell on that right now because we're going to dwell on that later. So if you're here live or catching a replay, you can join us live for sure every Friday, profitflywheel.com. Sometimes our Mondays open up. Mondays are typically giving updates on PPP. Dan will pull on his tax expert, Kyle, and they'll break down any PPP updates and answer any questions, which I think you guys did this week, yesterday.
We did yesterday. I think most of you probably got the email to that. New legislation has come out, however, so we're putting together a new training, and for sure on June the 18th at 1 p.m. Pacific, we will be going over updated training in partnership with Umpqua Bank. So for sure, June 18th, we have a detailed training based off the new legislation. And Kyle from my team, who you referenced, as tax director, will be on there for that. We may do some trainings in between, but my expectation is new bill out. We need time to read through it. We also need to see what the SBA comes out with. So there's been a danger in the past of trying to interpret things before the SBA has, and then their interpretation is different than what the experts are, and they sort of have the final say.
Yep. So we'll make sure you get emails for that. If you opt in anywhere, you will get an email about that. Okay, so Profit Flywheel, every Friday, sometimes Monday, where we're breaking down cash flow engineering, customers for life, revenue multiplication, and get cash now. We call them ACE cards. These are the components of the Profit Flywheel. So if you were to go to Dan and say, hey, I want to be an equity partner, please help me double my profits and get to where I want to be. These are the processes that you would get run through depending on where you're at. The revenue multiplication class actually has a workbook that can tell you exactly which component, which section of the flywheel you need to be focusing on. So if you're a member and you have not been through the revenue multiplication class, it's in there. Great walkthrough, workbook, all that stuff. And the question is always, should I do a thing, or what thing should I do next when we're talking about the flywheel? Specifically, Dan says this all the time when it comes to the cash flow engineering, the financial side. The big question is, am I going to be okay? But overall, I think the question that a lot of us are waking up, am I going to be okay? And what should I do next? Should I even do a thing? That's what these days, Fridays, Flywheel Fridays are dedicated to, is helping you make decisions on should you do a thing? And if so, what should that thing be? And equally important, I'll point out, sometimes you should not do a thing. Sometimes doing nothing is the best course of action. Okay. So today, we're going to talk about the thing that everybody's here for, and that is wealth. I call Dan the wealth wizard all the time. So we're going to break down some of his concepts, his principles, and really get to the bottom of what is wealth, right? And that's going to require a few frame shifts. Wealth, as we determine it, and this is, again, this might be a frame shift because you think wealth and you think Scrooge McDucking into a pile of coins. But Dan and I talk about it all the time, privately and as much as we can publicly. Wealth may be slightly different for everybody. When we say wealth, we mean healthy, wealthy, wise, sleep well at night, spend time with your family, things that actually matter to you. And I want to give Dan the floor here because one of the things he explains so well is, and one of the biggest frustrations with perhaps people in our audience is they're looking for the binary yes or no. What do I do? Just tell me. And the very first frame shift that I implore you to embrace is that there is no right answer, and it is what Dan always calls preference based. So Dan, if you want to break down a little bit the way you explain the preference based decision making, and maybe help people understand that there's just not a, unfortunately, there's just not a right or a wrong.
Yeah, I think there's a biological component, as well as maybe just some ways in which society is structured that pushes us towards this direction where we think that everything is binary, that somehow it's either right or wrong, yes or no, and so we apply this sort of fact fiction narrative to solve most of our problems. And that would mean if things were truly binary, then everything could be automated. We could just, AI could completely replace us because it's just a series of decision trees and is this yes, is this no? And or when we're trying to solve a problem with our business, we would just go to Google or search engine of choice and enter in our problem and we'd get the answer because it's binary. So we put in, should I grow my business? And then Google would tell us the answer. Or should I hire some employees or offer a 401k program or health insurance, so on and so forth. But clearly that doesn't work. That things are not that binary. That what you want as an individual is not necessarily what I want. Somebody could want to grow their business and another person could not want to grow their business, and both could be correct. I talked to a new private client yesterday, in his, say, late 30s, has about $2 million in cash, and has a really steady job where he gets stock options, and he's completely miserable. And so what one might say, this guy's really wealthy. He's in his 30s, he's got $2 million bucks. And based off his compensation, in the next few years, he might have $5 million bucks, and he does not feel wealthy. He feels miserable, and that's his daily reality. Why? Because he's in a profession that he doesn't enjoy. And on top of that, he doesn't have any time to spend with his significant other, and he wants to run a business. He's in a technical space now, and he wants to run some businesses. Those are completely preferences. Other people within the organization, and he works for a large Fortune 500 company, he has peers that are in different business units, but it's effectively the same role, and they are content. And so two people or several people who are in the same position financially, yet some are quote unquote happy, some people aren't. And so wealth is this relative position to a degree, which is, in my opinion, a combination of sort of the healthy, wealthy, wise concept, in the sense that wealth is more, not just numbers. It's also about the things that you want, and because they're preferences, there isn't a right or wrong. It's truly what you want. I often use the food as an example, because if somebody said, hey, I really don't like mayo, which is my case, you wouldn't be like, oh my gosh, you're such a terrible person because you don't like mayo. Somehow, like food, folks are a little bit more tolerant, I would say, about like preferences of like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like you just don't like the taste. That's fine. But when somebody says they don't want to grow their business or they don't want to hire employees, on and on and on, somehow there's like, well, that's not the way you do business, as if there is a right or wrong. And so there is a different contextual framework, however, if you are working for a big corporation. big corporations have shareholders. Shareholders are required to maximize shareholder value, in which case the range of decisions that they have to choose from is much more limited, because it all goes back to, is it making shareholders more money? Is it growing the overall value of the business at the rate that shareholders expect? So those preferences are much more limited or eliminated for a big corporation. But for a small business owner and an individual, that's not the case. It's, what do you want? What's going to get you closer to the things that you want? And that's why the frameworks that we've developed, frankly, and are the outcome of recognizing that so much of the stuff in conventional finance doesn't work for a small business owner, or doesn't work for an individual, because big business finance is about maximize, small business and individuals about optimize. Let's get you closer to the things that you want. Totally different. And so this took me years to figure out, frankly. And I went to business school, accounting degree, basically an IT, information systems degree, worked for big companies across the board. And then I started working with small business owners, and the recommendations, the tools that I was presenting were things that the client would say they want, but wouldn't implement, because it came back to, like, this isn't actually getting me closer to the things I want. This is busy work. So we had to build an entirely new toolkit to be more aligned with kind of the optimized notion and the fact that preferences drive everything. And that's basically what we do in this program, and one-on-one with my clients, where I showed them this example of the person who's got around $2 million to show, here's how in the next year you can quit your job, and the exact steps that you need to take to fund all of your profit priorities, because we're optimizing towards you quitting your job. Since we're optimizing towards one thing rather than 20 things, we can solve for that. It's not, we can sequence it, and we can figure out the exact amount of cash that you need to make that happen without sacrificing the long term, because we're optimizing for this one thing. If we're optimizing for singularly just make the most amount of money, then you're probably staying at that job. So figuring out those priorities and those preferences allow you to then figure out the next action steps, because he'd been 8 years in this specific job, miserable, feeling trapped. And within an hour, we figured out, here's exactly what you want. Here's the sequence. Here's the cost. Here's how much you have. Here's roughly how much things are going to grow. So this is exactly how much. These are the steps that follow. But it all came back to preferences.
And it's possible, perhaps probable, and that might just be in my world of small business owners that are hyper, they live in the marketing frame. You know, we've talked at length about that. That sometimes we say, okay, the solution to my problems is more, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And we get so stuck on more. If I made more money, I could quit my job, for example. And the focus on simply making more money could very well get us further away. It could make a longer timeline before we could quit our job, right? And so,
yeah, then there's a danger in making more, because often folks then spend more. And I'll just give an example of, in the CPA firm space, when you work for, there's sort of these four big, it's called the Big Four, basically these four global accounting firms that do most of the audit and tax work for publicly traded companies and large corporations. And there's sort of this thing where when you become manager or senior manager, you almost get stuck. Like, at this point, you might as well ride it out. So there's a point when you actually need to leave before it's too late, because you've now started making more and most likely spending more. So you boxed yourself in where based off your income and your salary, it's hard to leave without taking a step back. So that's just an example that comes to mind of how if you make more but you spend more and you take on more fixed costs, we talk about this in cash flow engineering, which is that as people make more, they take on more and more fixed costs. Personal space, that might be a mortgage and a car payment, spouse and kids, that your fixed costs, your commitments that you have to pay have gone up. Those are positive things if those are your preferences. But if your preference is, I just want 10 more hours per week, or I want more white space, or so on and so forth, you might have gotten further away.
Yep. Which leads to the Pyrrhic victory. If you're not familiar, it is the things that are won at such a great cost that it actually was not worthwhile. An example, I use this one. I just watched Aladdin, the third Aladdin last night. It was on in the background. But you see this in like treasure hunt movies all the time. I got to go get this treasure so my family can have a better life. You get so fixated on the treasure, on acquiring stuff, you lose your family. So you win, but you didn't really get any closer to the thing that was important. And that's one of the things Dan introduced to me that I want to get into in this second frame shift. But it is keeping your Dan, if you want to break down the methodology really quick, but keeping your priorities. He calls them the profit priorities. Like I I I don't, but I should. Like write them down and keep them right in front of you all the time.
Yeah, I
So
think
that you
recently
can.
we challenged folks to actually take the step and do this. But in our framework, we talk about, and everything that we do, we talk about. First step is to compile your data, and what we're trying to do is understand what our current position is. So where are we? If you're trying to get to, if you're using Google Maps, this first step in the equation is what's your current location, and then where do you want to go? But if you don't put in your current location, the directions are going to be completely flawed, right? So step one is that compiling, understanding our current position. And in the financial context, what are my assets and my liabilities? What are all the risks associated with the business? But also, because everything really comes back to your priorities and these preference-based decisions, then we have to understand what is it that we're really trying to fund. And so what are those things? Is it 10 more hours per week? Is it buying a house? Is it a car? Is it it really can be anything. Uh, but it's important to be honest with yourself about what those are. So we mapped out what are the priorities, the things that we want. What is the rank ordering of them? So what's number one, what's number two, what's number three, which is super important because it goes back to, we have to optimize, we can't maximize. So uh, back to the example of the person with a couple $1 million, until he got clarity on the thing that I'm optimizing for is being able to leave my job. We couldn't solve it because there were too many competing things. We can't do all of them at once. You don't have the resources to do that. Time, mostly didn't have the time. It's working more than full time. So we got to find the order, and then we need to figure out what's the timeline. So in his case, I want to leave my job in the next 2 years, and then how much will that cost? What is the cost to leave my job? What is the cost to have 10 more hours per week? What is the cost to buy a home? So some things are really obvious: buying a home, buying a car. You can go find those values online. Here's how much a Tesla costs with all the things that bells and whistles that I want. But things that are more nebulous, like 10 hours a week, require a little bit more thought and strategy. So we need to get clear on that and understand what they are, what the order is, how much it's going to cost, and when we want to achieve that objective by, that priority by. Once we know that, then it's math. Then it's math going, how much cash do I have now? What are the assets? How are they growing? And if I didn't do anything different, if I didn't change anything, would I be able to fund those priorities it within the timelines that I've set? And if not, how much extra money do I need to make that happen? And so it becomes math, but absent actually doing the work to put in the sequences and the time frames and the dollar value, you're left with, hey, I have a bunch of stuff that I want and I'm chasing my tail. I'm not getting any closer. I'm frustrated. What do I do next? And you can't answer that question because there's too many variables. If you try to solve x plus y, if you said x plus y equals 10, and then I asked you, well, what's the value of x? And what's the value of y? You couldn't, the math equation, it's multivariable. You can't solve that. You can't solve multiple variables with the data that I provided. So, but if we said x plus 6 equals 10, then we could say, well, x must be 4 because 4 plus 6 is 10. And so when we have multiple variables, the equation is essentially impossible to solve, and you end up chasing your tail. So we've got to get it down to the data points that actually then allow us just to solve for one variable.
Yep, it's something that I used to try to do kind of back of hand, and we'll talk about it shortly again. But Dan, you've put it into such a palatable, like the workbooks. This is actually a step-by-step process. It seems incredibly nebulous, but through cash flow engineering, revenue multiplication, even the tax optimization, it's just a step-by-step process. And FRAMESHIFT 2, when we're talking about wealth and getting things to matter, is something we already touched on a little bit, but it's that more rarely gets you closer to the things that actually matter. You alluded to it, or you said it already. You know, if we have 50 things that we want, we have to default to just, man, if I have enough money, I can have all these things. And what I see when I look at the profit priority methodology and I talk to my clients, and I see you talk to yours, is like, okay, well, to get anything done, we have to prioritize. If you know anything about getting stuff done, you got to be able to prioritize, which is your profit priorities. And then can we get it so that every step, can we have few enough priorities and have enough clarity so that we can determine, will this step get me closer? And so the shift that I recommend everybody kind of embrace is the understanding that more, there are absolute scenarios we talked about where more can get you further away from wealth as we're defining it here. What we need is a process or a system to determine, if I do this and I get this kind of outcome, is that getting me closer to these one or two or three things? Not, is it making the number bigger? You know, is it getting me more likes on Facebook, more views, more vanity metrics? But instead of more, thinking closer. And you do this in your roadmap process, which is absolutely brilliant, is you have a systematic way, right, of showing, like, this is, if you go the course you're going now, this is the outcome. This is the best. This is probably the outcome, right? But if we take these steps, it gets you this much closer. It's not framed in, look how much more stuff you'll have, but it gets you this much closer to the things that matter. And that's in your certainty roadmap.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I think where the concept of more tends to break down is in the sort of understanding of causation versus correlation. So the assumption is, by having more sales, or that therefore that's going to cause me to get closer to the things that I want. It may be correlated, like by virtue of having more sales over time, you've made some other decisions that then got you closer to the things that you want. So it's related, but it's not necessarily a one for one. This week, we had more sales for our 7 steps to cash. Right? We have more sales, but it costs us more because we changed our ad strategy, or we added to our ad strategy. We didn't change our ad strategy. We added to our ad strategy. And so right now it costs us more because we're running some traffic, some cold traffic. It's costing, we spent, say, $100 to make $49. So we don't actually have, we have more sales, this is just an example, but less cash, right? And so the and so really the question is, what are we trying to get more of, which goes back to priorities, and then understanding that causation, correlation, connection. And so the things that we're focusing on, we're assuming that will cause us to get closer to what we want. Hey, I'm going to launch a new product, and that's going to cause me to get closer to the things that I want. Well, it may not actually, because you may be spending time in the wrong places, and it's taking you away from things that are higher leverage, things that are going to get a higher, greater return on your time. Which is why we developed the 4 lenses and some of the other frameworks to go, how do we actually figure out where we should be spending our time, where we can allocate more to, so that does actually cause us to get closer to what we want. So more can be a trap, and there are shiny objects, things that we're drawn to. Sales, the fundamental assumption, similar to kind of the fundamental attribution error, to some degree. The fundamental assumption is that more sales will mean more cash and more profits.
Yep.
But we could show you countless examples of how that's not true because of things like ad spend or hiring staff at the wrong time or assuming that 1 month of peak sales is the new trend. So there are a lot of things where we assume more sales means more cash, when in fact we're worse off. We took on more risks.
So there's also a component of, just to add a dimension, is there may be 3 ways to make more sales. Method A is likely to produce the highest number of sales. Method B, somewhere in the middle. Method C, more sales, but maybe not as much. But method A may directly conflict or compete with another priority, which would maybe be free time. Maybe if you sell using method A, you got to work Saturday and Sunday to deliver a webinar, but one of your priorities is go to all your kids' baseball games, which are on Saturday and Sunday. Right. So optimizing for more sales here, again, get you one step further away from the thing that we've predetermined, hopefully, is important. And so I just, the framework, first time I saw Dan's roadmap, it occurred to me that here's the best way I can explain it. We got cash flow engineering, which is generate more cash flow. It's Dan's methodology. You can go into a business doing a decent amount of revenue and double their profits almost overnight. The actual implementation takes time, but you go in, double profits, generate more cash flow. And then the tax optimization roadmap is keep more. Everybody wants to keep as much of the money they made as possible. Revenue multiplier is multiplied exponentially by adding new streams of income in a very strategic way. And the financial barbell is systematically increasing certainty. And that actually doesn't really belong here, because what I'm doing here is I'm showing you cash flow engineering, generate more cash flow. Cool. That's a nice promise. Everybody else is promising more cash flow. Tax optimization roadmap, right? Keep more. Everybody out there has some random tax strategies they're teaching. Revenue multiplier. Everybody's got a 3-step funnel that's going to multiply your revenue. The fundamental difference to me, and the reason that I gravitate towards Dan and we work together, is that there's a little bit extra. It's generating more cash flow to get you closer to what matters to you. You're going to see a theme here. It's keeping more in a way that gets you closer to what matters to you in the short term and the long term. If you haven't been through some of the tax optimization stuff, it's just phenomenal the way that Dan thinks about it. Revenue multiplier. Again, we're gonna exponentially multiply the amount of revenue you make and profits you make. It's a big promise. A lot of people make that promise. I've never met anybody that has a methodology to do it in a way that actually gets you closer to the things that matter. Right. So that's the underlying theme. And the barbell, which I'm stoked to talk about the next couple of weeks, is just systematically increasing certainty. Um, the thing that appeals, and it may not be why it was built, but the thing that appeals about it to me is, one, I love the barbell. I use the barbell framework for multiple different things. But two, there's there's something built in to protect us from ourselves where, hey, look, we generated some extra cash flow, and before we have a chance to spend it, it gets set aside. And I think we'll talk about that at length, in a week or two, whenever we get around to it. Um, but that's Dan. If you want to jam on it for a minute, that's the thing that I think is most attractive to the people here. The most attractive to me is just the realization that there are countless numbers of ways to generate cash flow right now for anybody. And some things are off the table, like some things we're just not willing to do for ethical reasons or whatever, but there's still so many ways. And it's systematically eliminating the ones that are going to get you further away, and then using your four lenses to determine the ones that'll get you closer. That seems to be the thing that people need to understand in order to really appreciate nth degree and the wealth Q&A and all the stuff that you do.
Yeah, so much of this for me goes back to the cliche story that we all know, which is the person on their deathbed who has regrets. And I've never wanted to be that. I've never wanted to be that person. That from like a very young age, for whatever reason, that's just been a thought of, I don't want to live a life of regret, and find myself like in this moment where I'm on my deathbed with all these regrets. And for whatever reason, legacy has been just something that's important to me. And the way I think about legacy, like it's a preference, right? So it's not necessarily about leaving my kids a bunch of money. It's about something my dad, who didn't have a chance to go to school and was basically homeless when he was 14, and my mom had to raise her two younger sisters starting when she was nine years old, that they said to me and my sister growing up, which is their job as parents, which in my opinion they did, was they want us to have more opportunity than they had, and that they always wanted us to be smarter and more educated than them. And for me, that's the legacy that I want to pass on to my kids, which is I want them to be better off, and I want to leave the community in a place that's better off. And it's not necessarily about money, although money is part of it. So that's just been something I've always been sort of thinking about, and continue to think about, and thought a lot about the last week, 10 days, is this the state of the world, and how am I really contributing? And in spite of all of that being something that I consistently go back to, especially in the early days of my business, I found like I'm just living that cliche. I'm working more, putting in more hours for like some payoff in the future. Like, okay, I just need to grind now and hustle now, because 5 years from now, the results are going to be worth it. And what happened was I didn't get any closer. 5 years in, and this last week was 10-year anniversary. 4 or 5 years in, it's like, man, I don't feel like we've got more revenue and more staff, more clients, but I don't feel like I'm any closer to the things that I want. Am I really leaving a legacy? Am I doing all this stuff? And so it'd be easy just to put my head down and go, well, the problem is that I haven't made the business big enough. Like, I'd make more impact if I worked harder and I did more. But why would that be true? Because none of the data actually supports that, because I spent the last 5 years doing it. I have 500 clients who've done the same thing and have similar perspectives and are in a similar place, which is they just keep putting their head down and they're not any closer to what they actually want. And that's what drives me. That's what's caused me to continually go back and go, is this actually getting me closer to the things that I want? Because life is fleeting and I don't want to live that cliche life where I'm on my deathbed with regret. And I want to know that the legacy that I'm leaving is something similar to the legacy that I feel like my parents are leaving, which is they took their challenges and they gave my sister and I a better life. And I owe the same to them to pay that forward. And so that's, I guess, feeling a little bit emotional and waxing a little bit philosophic, but that's really what this is all about to me.
So if you're 5 years in or 10 years in, or 1 year in, you may feel similar. The hamster wheel, people throw that around a lot. I know quite a few people that have said, "Hey, I've doubled my revenue. I'm not there yet. And I tripled my revenue. I'm not there yet. Actually, I'm not even any closer." And one of the reasons that we present things this way and share things like we do is that if you're in a similar place, here's a different way. It's just a different way to look at things and get closer. If you are not there yet, and this is, I generally don't like working with people that are just starting, because there's nothing you do to convince them that like more revenue is not going to solve all the problems. And I get that, but the hope is by presenting things this way and Dan sharing, his stories, and I'll share mine, is that maybe you don't have to touch the stove, again, it took 5 years and 500 clients. Seeing those other 500 clients probably made it so you didn't have to go another 5 years. So the hope is you'll have to touch the stove. And the hope is that you continue to tune in, because over the next 5 to 7 weeks, we're going to break down how to generate more cash flow to get closer to what actually matters, how to monitor or how to navigate the tax landscape, the revenue multiplication, which is streams of income. It's very, very tempting to add streams of income and not understand the second, third, and subsequent order consequences of what you're doing, which again can get you further away from what really matters. And the barbell, I'm just going to share some of those frameworks. It'll for sure be every Friday. Some Mondays you'll get notified, and if you're registered, you get a replay. So profitflywheel.com. If you have any partners, any friends, any clients, any coaches, consultants that is stuck on this hamster wheel that Dan just described, please just head to profitflywheel.com. These are free. These are the only free one we do. But again, hoping to, again, Dan talked about legacy, hoping to help as many people as possible. It's not good for anybody, in my opinion, if people like Dan, I think Nolan was on here. I can't see the participants right now. The people, so the Dans and the Nolans and so many people on here. Again, I'd name y'all if I had my thing open. It's not good for anybody if people like you that have a skill, a gift, want to leave a legacy, burn out. Nobody benefits if all the great service providers of the world burn out and give up, quit, or just hit a wall and get stuck. And it's not fair to you, your family, all that stuff. So hopefully you join us.
That was a big question on Wednesday. So Wednesday we do a Q&A that's everyone's got their screens on, not everyone, if they want to have their screens on and they can unmute their mics, so it's more of a meeting format than a webinar format. And the big topic was, I understand all these frameworks, but I've just got some stuff that I don't want to do, and I can't get over that felt sense of I just don't want to do it. So you can give me all these frameworks, but that doesn't help me get over the feeling of I don't want to do it. So how do I actually overcome that? And so I think we spent nearly an hour maybe, talking about that. Because it's a real thing. You can study all the frameworks and read all the textbooks and then still be left with avoidance. And so how do you actually navigate the reality of like the push and pull between the stuff you want to do and the stuff you have to do? And I always imagine it as this tug of war that goes on in your brain of what you have to do and what you want to do. And so sometimes that tension becomes too great. And so we were kind of walking through how you, from our experiences, what's the cause of that. And maybe it's willpower, maybe it's not, but it doesn't really matter. You're in the place where you're actively avoiding things. So how do you get through that? And oftentimes it goes back to there's been such a prolonged disconnect between the things that they wanted and the things that they were doing. And so that duplicitness eats away at your psyche. I mean, if you're it eats away and erodes, and over time you lose the confidence and the desire and the willpower to execute on it. And so there's no universal silver bullet, but getting clarity on the priorities and realigning so that you can see that you're going to fund those rather than just putting your head down is necessary.
Yep. The concept again of closer versus more to me is powerful, because if you can align, go back to Google Maps, the GPS. If you can actually see the distance between where you're at and where you're trying to go, if you can see it getting closer and closer, closing that distance, it gets a little bit easier to one, navigate and be motivated to do so. So we'll do questions in just a moment. First, if it's your first time here, it's the first time you're seeing us, if it's maybe somebody shared this with you, maybe you've been around for a while, you can hit cfeclass.com/7 steps. And what that's going to do is it's going to give you from all the frameworks we shared, cash flow engineering, revenue multiplication, all those classes, all those calls, Dan pulled out the 7 most immediate wins that are short game wins, but they're also long game wins, meaning it'll help you understand some of these frameworks and these concepts. And it looks like this. So just so you kind of see what you're getting here. People are always like, what is it going to be? A 1-page PDF with a graphic? No, it's a full, here's 7 strategies, action items, notes, transcripts, and also unlocking the profit, because we talked about it today. If you've already bought it, you already have it, go get 7 steps, get the profit priority workbook. So we talked a little bit about getting clear on priorities and figuring out what matters. Dan built a workbook. You have your own copy right here. You can watch a video to kind of see how it works and how to fill it out, answer some questions, as well as just some more foundational wealth principles and replays of previous profit flywheels. Those are all unlocked for you. So if you hit cfeclass.com/7 steps, those will be there for you. 7 steps to cash strategy swipe. And just speaking to, because we'll have Q&A in a moment, speaking to what Dan said about understanding the frameworks, understanding the concepts, the principles, even the action steps. There's a really powerful thing in dialogue. It's really, I think that's probably our platinum and our diamond members. They get the most out of saying, cool, I understand this framework. But then just like on Wednesday, they're just having an opportunity to talk through it with somebody and explore some of the things. And Dan and I are neither one of us is afraid to ask hard questions. We'll ask each other hard questions right in front of everybody too. So if you go into 7 steps and it's appealing, it makes sense, and you feel stuck somewhere, it's really easy to reach out, to upgrade, and just spend some time with us in a group setting or even on a one-on-one setting. So jump into 7 steps. Make sure it all makes sense. If it all makes sense and you can implement, awesome. if it all makes sense and you feel stuck, there is no shortage of potential support. So just know that we're not going to sell you a 7-step thing and then tell you to bugger off. Uh, Anything else, Dan, before we hit questions?
I don't think so. Some
Uh,
good questions.
Ben says it's legit, no brainer, especially the price. Thank you. And already jumped in. It's good stuff. Awesome. Andrew's got a question. Thinking through the $7 intro offer strategy, we're talking about doing a step-by-step PDF on how to rank in Google for $7 and run ads to that. Then push people to a get a client mini course. Just thinking that through and not sure if it's the best idea. What you got, Dan?
Well, I always go back to uh, what's the long-term strategy? What are we building towards? And and then based off what we're building towards, have we hedged our downside risks? So using those 4 lenses. So when we originally came up with, we're going to build an app, which I broke this week, which is why it's not, people can't log in, but it'll be fixed hopefully by the end of today. But the original goal was we want to build an app, and but we could only say that it was going to be a time savings based off the data that we had. We couldn't say it was going to be definitively a revenue generating thing. We couldn't say it was going to be an expense reduction, and we couldn't necessarily say it was going to be a forcing function. So it didn't check at least 3 of the 4 lenses, in which case the answer was, oh, we can't do this, but still want to. And I think that there's a longer term play. So how do we hedge our downside risk, which is when we determined that we were going to build a program like this. It's evolved into this. It wasn't this originally in the way that we structured it. But we said, I think we can pay for some of the app or a lot of the app, and if we do this Q&A thing. So let's take a micro step and just ask our people, would you buy this program if we put it out there, which is what we did last May. So generated some income, made it a super no-brainer offer, but we generated some income. Okay, now we've got this thing, this program. So we've generated some revenue for the app, but we got to do these calls. What else how can we leverage this time? Well, and so we built strategies that sort of fell off of that, where we codify methodologies on a quarterly basis and turn them into additional products, other assets, so on and so forth. So it was all part of it, but it all came back to this question of how can we build an app and stay within our frameworks to make it make sense. As we did that, we realized what we know is that when we create stuff the first time, so cash flow engineering, we're going to re-record that soon. Revenue multiplication, we're going to re-record it, slides and other stuff. This is the first time that we're really sharing it with anybody publicly, and so there's a fair amount of complexity to a degree in the initial version. It's like the first batch of anything is going to have more complexity, and as you do it, you can figure out shortcuts and things like that. So we start doing the 7-step stuff. So we got 7 steps to cash and 7 steps to before you pivot your business, because we needed to start thinking through how can we simplify our programs, and also I needed a forcing function to think through some places that I was stuck on the book that I've been working on called Seeking Certainty. So the $7 offer that we have was the outcome of like this overall kind of strategy that we work through to go, we need to simplify things to make the cash flow engineering more sellable to get some content from the book for the book, and so on, and also see what the reaction is, because it might help us liquidate some existing ad spend. So I guess a long road to get to a lot of details to get to that point. But the $7 thing was the byproduct of everything else rather than the initial starting point. Because in and of itself, the $7 offer, if we just launched a $7 offer now, we would lose our shorts on it. Because the $7 offer now only works because 70% of people buy the bump and upgrade to, at the time of purchase, I think it's 70%, buy the bump for cash flow engineering, and then 40% upgrade also into platinum and to our platinum offer. And then for those, that's at sort of the initial time of purchase. And then people who don't buy any of the bumps within 19 days, they usually buy something. So if it weren't for these other existing programs, we would be losing our shorts on the $7 offer.
Yep. And it's been very bottom up in that, I'm just echoing what Dan said. It's been very bottom up and versus the top down. Because we started with the $7 thing. To make it work, we would then have to try to find stuff to sell. Right? We have to make stuff to sell it, which is cool, but the app, right? We're still optimizing. Like the end game is still the app. And so if we get in a rush to like, okay, what else can we sell? It's very easy to start putting time into things that do not directly get us closer to getting that app to the place where it needs to be.
Yeah, so Andrew says my framework would be $7 book, 97 client acquisition mini course, 997 full program. Standard, I guess, ascension ladder. I would invert that. I'd use micro steps and go, hey, I'm thinking of building this full program. Anybody interested? And then put them on a list and then sell them the full program. And then in the process of now you've generated and decide in advance, I need to sell at least 5 or I need to sell at least 10 of this full program for this to make sense. Now that I've got the full program and I paid for building it, when I'm building it, we've already sold 180 copies.
Yeah. I'll tell you. Yeah,
go ahead.
I would look, I might go rotate too far, but I would look at just going through Dan's lenses again. If you already have the full course and it's doing well, is there something that would create a time savings, a cost savings, a forcing function for maybe something that you've needed to build, maybe onboarding or something for the course, and then turn around and sell that? So like if onboarding would make your course a million times better, save you time, save you money, and you've been avoiding it, I would buckle down and build that and then package it up and make it the $7 thing. If that makes sense.
Yeah, Andrew's probably familiar with this, but in marketing analytics, there's a term called cannibalization, which is basically I just launch a new product and it's cannibalizing my other sales. It's eating away at my other sales. And so there's a danger that you're already selling 180 copies of the full course by offering the $7 book. Does it cannibalize the sales? Do people divert and then buy the book instead of buying the program? So I think there's probably, to your point, Nick, using the 4 lenses, is it a forcing function? Is it a time savings? Is it revenue producing? Is it an expense reduction? Those are the 4 lenses. We want to check the box on at least 3 of the 4 on any idea. That's my criteria. Some people have reduced that threshold to say 2 out of the 4 is their criteria. We use 3 of the 4. And we take every idea and we run it through the lens, and then we see what's going to have the highest impact, and we start with that one first. So maybe $7 book for you is the highest. When you run it through the 4 lenses, it's going to be the highest leverage thing. But if I'd want to see all of the cards, all the things that you want to do, ideas, if you have apps, other businesses you want to start, what your priorities are. So what are you trying to get closer to? Because this may back to the like more might get you further away, which is the $7 book might cannibalize your sales, or take some time to create, and it's going to take away from the other stuff that you want to do. So I get everything down, all of your ideas, run it through the 4 lenses, and see where it falls out, and then take micro steps.
It wasn't as quantifiable until I saw Dan's 4 lenses, but longest time. And it bought in sales. Yeah, if you're already giving it away, I'd sell it for 7. What I would not do is I would not take time away from the main thing just to have a $7 thing, which is, I think a lot of people do that when they see like, ooh, low ticket traffic liquidator. They take time away from the main thing just to have a completely separate thing, because they, as Dan would say, they named the puppy on having a $7 thing.
So Nick, what would be a micro step where he could test that? Because we were talking about this one-on-one. One of us would say, hey, what's going to be the unintended consequence of flipping this from free to paid, like from costing $0 to costing $7?
I would say, only because I have some I'm making assumptions about Andrew. I know him well enough. I would actually split test it, because I believe Andrew goes entirely to cold, direct line to cold. So there's probably a little bit less of a risk for cannibalizing your audience. And I have no idea how many of your, based on your message, are freebie seekers. I would probably just throw a $7 or a $5.60 or a $6.55 or whatever, and just split test it, assuming you're actually going. I think he just goes straight to cold on YouTube. Yep, straight to cold. And Facebook ads.
How long? Because you probably got to go, because you got to figure out now what's the cost to acquire them for the $7 thing, and then how long will it take them to.
I would start, and again, I kind of backhand it because I have the same superpower Dan does. I think my lifetime value is unusually high, so I'm a little more flexible on front end KPI. But if you were running it as a free lead magnet before, you should have the cost per acquisition from that lead magnet. I would run traffic about 1.5 or 2 times the cost per acquisition. So if it costs you $600 from that lead magnet to acquire somebody, I would run between, I'm not talking about the cost of acquisition on the lead magnet. I'm talking about, you said you got purchasers from the course. So if the lead magnet led to $600 course purchases, I would use that as the baseline. So it might be $19 to get a $7 buyer, but they turn into course buyers for $300, if that makes sense. Because you already have a baseline. If they go from cold to freebie to course, you have that cost per acquisition. I'd be curious, can you match that or beat that with the $7 front end? And if so, I wouldn't worry so much about the cost per acquisition of the $7 thing, because you were giving it away for free before. So it's a relative improvement. Assuming the course is the thing you want to sell. If you were just flat out audience building, I might have a different. I know you're not an audience guy. Yep, course and monthly. Yep, I would take the cost per acquisition for a course from a lead magnet and start with 1.5 or 2 times that. Dan G, who's actually way more risk averse than I am, but he'll actually go 3 times acquisition when he's testing something new, because he knows how to optimize it down.
Yeah. Of course, I would caveat by saying, what do you have in your investment reserve? So we're advocates for setting up reserves, because we're gambling on something new. So part of how much you're going to use it, maybe up to 3 times, like Dan G might do, assuming that we have the money in the reserves. Otherwise, we're playing with the rent money.
Yep. Cash flow engineering.
Had
Cool.
to throw it in.
It's appropriate.
I got a
Awesome.
couple more minutes. If I don't know about you, Nick, if anyone else has any other questions they want to throw in.
I got time. Go ahead, drop questions. Anything you got? It's the one opportunity if you're not a platinum or a diamond member to ask. Q&A. Cool, thanks. That's not a question, homie. I got excited. I thought we had a
Erica
question.
says, newbie question, can you go over the four lenses again with a mini explanation? Yeah, for sure. So let me give you a little bit of like historical context. So some of you know, but maybe not all of you, because we got some new faces and Erica says she's a newbie. First part of my career was in this area of finance or wealth called hedging. Maybe you've heard the term derivatives before. Maybe you've heard hedge funds. But basically the idea of hedging is that we're trying to eliminate risks. And those risks can take many different shapes and forms, but it depends on our intentions that kind of drive what the risks may be. So most larger companies that have a fair amount of cash, they have some systematic way of hedging risk. But again, small business owners, we've got to optimize. And the risk is, as a small business owner, we take a bet. And I think a lot of what we're doing as business owners is betting, is gambling. We're going to do a new thing, and we're betting that the investment is going to pay off. And so we're investing time and capital into it, capital money into it. And there are trade-offs when we do that, because we have limited resources. So when we invest our time, there's an opportunity cost to that, because there's something else we could have been doing, something different in our business, or we could have been enjoying life and spending time with our friends, family, otherwise. So there's always a trade-off. And so with that in mind, what I kept coming back to is, how do I figure out what the next thing is that I'm going to do while also trying to eliminate the downside risk? Said another way, I kind of got tired of the whole idea of like, to be a successful small business owner, you just have to keep failing. I'm not opposed to failing, but there's too much at risk at this point, where we've got employees, we've got family. I'm basically 100% commission. I think every business owner, you're basically 100% commission. If you don't bring in sales, there's not enough money for you to get paid. Everyone else has got to get paid first. So the idea that I can just sort of be gambling my rent money, hoping that the outcomes are going to be okay, just became no longer palatable to me. So that was sort of the background basis for developing the four lenses. Two are what I call qualitative, two are what I call quantitative. Qualitative, there's just not necessarily hard data to say that this is going to be the case. So the qualitative ones are, is this a forcing function? A forcing function would be that there's something that I want to do, and I want to write a book. So by committing to doing daily calls, that becomes a forcing function where I can do these daily calls, record them, turn them into transcripts. Now I have a starting point for the book. So by committing to the calls, it's a forcing function to generate content for the book. So that's an example of forcing function. It's causing me to get to do something I had planned on otherwise doing. Time savings would be, by doing this thing, will it save time now or in the future? So by building the app, the Certainty app, it won't save me time now because I got to build it all out, but it's going to save me a lot of time in the future, because it's a tool that the CPA firm that I own with Nolan, who's on here, Nolan Bradbury, my longtime business partner and even longer friend. Right now, the team is heavily reliant on us for profit, some of the math behind the profit priority. So by building the app, we can remove ourselves from the process. And so there's a time savings associated with it. And these are qualitative because they're more somewhat intuition to a degree, and based off, again, what you want to create. You want to have this forcing function to create something, or you want to have this time savings. So those are more qualitative. The quantitative is that we rely on what we call a preponderance of data. So one of our principles, and we heavily rely on principles for decision making because things are not binary, they're not so yes or no. We rely on principles, and one of our principles is that we're not going to speculate on the future unless we have a preponderance of data to support it. So we've got trends, data, otherwise, that tell us this is more likely than not. And so I can be an annoying person to work with because I'll go like, I have no expectation for sales on this $7 offer. What do you mean you have no expectations? Well, I have hopes, I have dreams of what it could be. Yeah, but there's no data to support this thing is going to sell at all because we've never sold it before. So how could I know with certainty until there's data? So is something revenue generating, and or is doing the thing going to result in saving us money, reducing our expenses? And so what we do is we take an idea or a thing we want to do, and we run it through the four lenses, and we go, is there any sort of forcing function, yes or no? Is there any sort of time savings? If so, how much? And then how much revenue based off data do we think this will generate? And how much in expense savings do we think this thing will generate? So we take every idea or thing and we run it through that, and we put it like an Excel file so that we can take all of our ideas and see all of the values for time savings, revenue, and expense to see what's going to have the biggest impact. And whatever has the biggest impact, that's going to be the thing that we're going to do first. Unless there's something that you're like, I think is a broader, based off my overarching priority. Why do I want to do an app? Well, that's a longer discussion, but based off one of my major priorities, I think the app makes sense. I can't check more than one lens currently. So if this is a major priority, what can I do to enable me to check those other lenses? So then we go through that exercise of like, what are the other strategies and micro steps? We talked about micro steps last Friday on this. What are the micro steps that we can take to get the data to launch the products so that the thing that does fund my priorities or is in alignment with my priorities meets my criteria if I need to check at least 3 of the 4 lenses. So that's the engine that we use to power a lot of the strategy and figure out the thing that we should do next and tie it back to our priorities. So hope that helped, Erica. Nick,
I did a quick screen share. I dropped the steps in there. If you want to review fastest path, if you're platinum or diamond, just go log into the member area and in Wealth Bundle resources. Profit Flywheel replays. We actually did one on 4 lenses. It's also in cash flow engineering. There, you can just go straight to cash. You can just work step by step through cash flow engineering, and you'll hit the 4 lenses as well. And that's some of the stuff that we're refilming for cash flow engineering and revenue multiplication is pulling these principles out. So it's the first thing you see when you come in.
Cool. All right. Yeah. Thanks for the question, Erica. Appreciate it. Nick, anything else to wrap up?
Nothing outside of hopefully you guys join us over the next couple of weeks. If you've not necessarily consecutively, but if you tune in, what we always do is share what we're doing and why. And it's a rare, from what I can tell, it may be out there in world, some spaces I don't know. You're actually seeing if you're in revenue multiplication, it's the first time any of that stuff's ever come out of Dan's mouth. Like some of it was being built right there on the call. And you see the process of what we're doing, why we're doing it. We come up with stuff like Wednesdays, specifically. If nobody has questions, we just start talking about our strategy, and we'll come up with stuff right there on the call. So I encourage you to keep showing up and just watch the reinvention. I think there's something to be learned for being a fly on the wall from both the stuff that we do right and the stuff, the micro steps we take that don't work. Um, we share all that stuff. So hopefully keep joining us. And if you have friends, business partners, peers that would benefit, profitflywheel.com will send them invite to these Fridays. That's all I got.
Cool. All right. Hope to see everyone on Monday and go from there.
Yep. You guys have a great weekend.